A millionaire pays a homeless woman to have a baby, but when the child was born, he was shocked by what he saw. Before we begin, take a moment to comment below with the city you're watching from. We'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Henry Lewis was 42 years old, a man who seemed to have it all. He was wealthy beyond measure, wielding power in every aspect of his life, and his name was recognized in the most elite circles. To the outside world, he was living the dream, but in the quiet moments behind the walls of his luxury mansion, he realized something troubling. Despite the wealth and influence surrounding him, there was one thing his money could not buy: an heir. He had everything: the finest cars, the most exquisite homes, and the respect of powerful people. Yet there was an emptiness he couldn't ignore. He had tried to build a family before, twice, but both marriages ended in disappointment and failure. The thought of love to Henry had become a myth, a mere illusion that only led to problems and heartache. What he needed now wasn't love. He needed something far more practical, something he could control: an investment, a legacy, a child, a continuation of his empire, someone who could carry on his name and wealth without the complexities of a traditional family. Henry was done with love and relationships. This time, there would be no emotional attachments, no messy feelings, just a contract, cold, hard, and efficient. With his vast resources, he was sure he could find someone willing to carry his child under strict terms, no strings attached. The next morning, Henry found himself in his sports car speeding through the city streets. His mind was not focused on the world around him, but on his mission: to find a woman who would accept his offer, no questions asked. He didn't need a partner. He needed someone who could fulfill his need for an heir. As he stopped at a traffic light near downtown, something caught his eye. On the corner of the sidewalk, there sat a young woman, hunched over a dirty piece of paper, sketching something with a pencil. Her brown hair was tangled, falling messily over her face, and her blue eyes seemed to shine despite her weary, unkempt appearance. She looked invisible to most, ignored by the world around her. But Henry, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, couldn't take his eyes off her. At first, he tried to ignore her. He told himself to focus on the task at hand, to keep driving and not waste time on distractions. But as the light turned green, he couldn't help but glance back at her. Who was this woman sitting there drawing on the sidewalk as if nothing else mattered? His mind began to race, but he quickly dismissed the thought. Annoyed, he pressed the gas pedal and sped off, leaving her behind. But as he drove a few blocks away, something nagged at him, a feeling that wouldn't let go. He stopped in a parking lot and sat there, staring at the steering wheel. This was ridiculous, he thought to himself. Why was he still thinking about her? But his instincts pushed him to act. Reluctantly, he turned the car around, his mind set on one thing: finding her again. When he returned to the spot, there she was, just as he had seen her before. She was still sitting on the sidewalk, leaning her paper against the wall, focused on her drawing. With a sigh, Henry pulled up to the curb and rolled down the window. His tone was direct, cold, and commanding. "Hey, you! Come here!" The woman looked up at him, her expression one of suspicion. Her eyes narrowed as she sized up the well-dressed man in the sleek sports car. She hesitated, unsure of what to make of him. "I'm not asking," Henry continued, his voice unchanged, now with a sharp edge. "Come on, I don't have all day." After a brief pause, the woman stood up, her thin frame making her seem even more fragile. She walked toward the car, her movements slow, almost reluctant. When she finally stood by the window, Henry could see how worn she looked, tired, gaunt, and out of place. But there was something else, a certain quiet strength in her demeanor, in the way she held herself. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Henry studied her for a moment. Her defiance intrigued him. "Get in," he said, his eyes unwavering. "I'll take you somewhere we can talk." She let out a dry laugh, almost mocking. "I'm not one of those if that's what you're thinking," she shot back, her voice laced with skepticism. Henry frowned, clearly irritated by her assumption. "Don't be absurd," he replied, his tone hardening. "I don't have time for that. I just want to talk. Now, get in the car, or you can keep living on that sidewalk." The hesitation lingered in her eyes, but there was something in his voice, something authoritative that left no room for argument. Finally, she opened the door and slid into the, not just one, but 2 heartbeats. "Well, here's the surprise we couldn't see last time," the doctor said, pointing to the screen. "You're expecting twins." Leah's eyes widened in disbelief. "Twins," she whispered, almost in a daze. She had never even considered that possibility. She felt a rush of emotions, surprise, joy, and a strange sense of wonder, though she couldn't quite make sense of it all in the moment. As she absorbed the news, she realized that everything was about to change in ways she hadn't anticipated. A wave of emotions washed over her, a mix of shock and joy. Instinctively, she placed a hand on her belly, trying to process the overwhelming news. Henry, for his part, remained silent for a few seconds, his serious expression slowly giving way to something Lila had never seen before, genuine awe. He leaned slightly forward, watching the screen intently. "2?" he asked, as if needing confirmation. "2," the doctor replied with a smile. "Both seem healthy and are growing well." The silence that followed was filled only with the sound of heartbeats echoing in the room. For Lila, that moment was magical. No matter how hard she tried to remain emotionally distant, she couldn't help but feel deeply connected to the 2 little lives growing inside her. The reality of it all was finally sinking in. Henry, standing beside her, seemed equally moved. Though he remained quiet, his eyes spoke volumes, something that words couldn't express. For the first time, he seemed vulnerable, touched by the idea of becoming a father to 2. As they made their way back to the mansion, the silence between them felt different. It wasn't the usual cold and distant silence they often shared, but something laden with meaning. Lila finally broke the stillness. "You don't seem like the kind of person who gets easily surprised," she commented, trying to lighten the tension. Henry sighed, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I'm not, but this—" He paused, carefully choosing his words. "This is different." Lila glanced at him, intrigued. Henry rarely showed any emotions, but now he seemed lost in thought. She couldn't help but wonder what was going on in his mind. "Is it scary?" she asked softly, almost in a whisper. He turned slightly to look at her before answering, his voice quieter than usual. "It's impressive, knowing that in a few months 2 completely new beings will be here, depending on me." Lila felt a pang of pain in her chest. She knew that eventually she would have to let go of these babies, but hearing him speak of them with such care made her realize how deeply connected she already was to them. "They also depend on me, at least for now," she said, trying to mask the emotion in her voice. Henry nodded, his gaze still on the road. "I know, and that's why I want to make sure you're okay, Lila. Not just physically, but in every way. That's important to me." She stayed silent, absorbing his words. It was the first time he had spoken so sincerely about what they were going through together. Later that night, Lila stood on the terrace, staring at the horizon, lost in thought. Henry appeared beside her, looking hesitant, a rare sight in his usually confident demeanor. "I can't stop thinking about what the doctor said today," he began, sitting next to her. 2 babies. Futures. Lila turned to him, surprised by his openness. "It's a lot of responsibility, isn't it?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. "It's more than that," Henry replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "This is the first time I feel like something in my life can't be calculated. I can't plan who these 2 will become. I can't control who they'll grow into." Lila felt a chill at his words. It was rare for Henry to admit that something was beyond his control, but in that moment she realized that, like her, he was changing. He was starting to see that not everything in life could be mapped out or planned in advance. "Sometimes that can be a good thing," she said, her voice quiet. "Not knowing what's next can bring things you never imagined." Henry looked at her, his eyes considering her words for the first time. He seemed to be coming to terms with the idea that some things in life couldn't be controlled. In the following days, the news of the twins brought an unexpected lightness to the mansion. Stephanie began making adjustments to the nursery, which had originally been prepared for just one baby, now adapting it for two. Lila watched the transformation with mixed feelings. She knew the agreement required her to give up the babies, but deep down, she realized it would be much harder than she had anticipated. As preparations continued, Lila and Henry started to realize that the contract that had once united them was now turning into something far more complicated. The twins, not even born yet, were already reshaping their lives in ways neither of them had foreseen. The days following the revelation of the twins brought a subtle yet significant shift in Lila and Henry's dynamic. Though he remained the same methodical and reserved man, small gestures began to surface, revealing a side of him Lila hadn't expected. One afternoon, after a medical appointment, Henry insisted on escorting her to the car, something he would typically leave to Stephanie or another staff member. "Are you okay?" he asked, holding the car door open for her. Lila nodded, surprised by the gesture. "Yes, I'm fine, thank you." On the drive back to the mansion, their usual silence was broken when Henry asked, "Is there anything you need? Anything that might make you more comfortable?" Lila glanced at him, trying to read his expression. It didn't feel like a superficial concern. There was something more genuine about it, though she wasn't sure how to interpret it yet. "Nothing to mind right now, but thank you for asking," she replied cautiously. Henry nodded and returned his focus to the road, but Lila sensed that something was shifting between them. Despite her reservations, it seemed that Henry was genuinely concerned about her. Back at the mansion, Lila began noticing more signs of change. One day, she found a set of new pillows and blankets in her room, accompanied by a simple note, "To help you rest better." She couldn't help but smile at the thoughtful gesture. It was a small act, but it carried so much meaning. Later, as she sipped tea in the living room, Henry entered and quietly sat in the armchair opposite her. He seemed more relaxed than usual, though still maintaining his usual serious demeanor. "Did you like what I left in your room?" he asked bluntly. "Yes, I did. It was thoughtful of you," Lila replied, studying him curiously. "Good," he said, not looking away. "I want to make sure you're comfortable. That's important to me." Lila frowned slightly. As much as she appreciated the kindness, there was still a barrier of mistrust she couldn't quite overcome. "You're changing, Henry, or at least it seems that way," she said directly, "but I still don't know why." Henry stared at her for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. There was something different in his gaze, something more vulnerable, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked away, as if unsure of how to respond. Deciding what to say, Henry finally sighed. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly. "Maybe I am changing. But the truth is, I don't know how to be different. I'm not used to caring." The words seemed to surprise him just as much as they did her. It was rare to see Henry admit any vulnerability, but there he was, revealing a side of himself that had always seemed locked away. That night, as Layla gazed up at the sky from the terrace, she reflected on their conversation. Henry wasn't what she had expected. He was still difficult to understand, still unpredictable, but there was something human beneath that controlling exterior. Layla couldn't tell if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Meanwhile, Henry sat in his office, staring at the contract that defined his arrangement with Layla. For the first time, he felt the weight of that document. He had started this with a clear goal, to have an heir and move on with his life. But now, things weren't so simple. He knew he was starting to care, and that terrified him. The next morning, Henry joined Layla for breakfast, something he rarely did. "There's something I'd like to discuss," he said, his tone direct. Layla looked up at him, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" He hesitated before answering. "I know you still don't trust me, and I can't blame you. I've never been good at trusting people, and that's turned me into someone who isn't easy to deal with." Layla stayed silent, letting him continue. "I've had experiences that taught me not to depend on anyone, not to let anyone get close enough to hurt me," he continued. "But with you, what we're building, I've realized that maybe I'm wrong." Layla blinked in surprise at his honesty. It was rare to hear Henry talk about himself this way. "We all have our barriers, Henry," she said softly. "But that doesn't mean we need to hide behind them forever." Henry nodded, seeming to consider her words. "Maybe you're right, but changing isn't easy for me." Layla gave a small smile. "No one said it would be." Later that day, Henry decided to join Layla for a walk in the garden. They talked about trivial things at first, the weather, the plants, but the conversation soon turned to the babies. "Have you thought about names?" Henry asked, surprising her. "No, not yet," Layla replied. "I thought that was something you'd want to decide on your own." Henry looked at her with a serious expression. "I think it would be fair to do it together." Layla was taken aback. To her amazement, Henry was trying to be more open, more present, and while she was still cautious, she couldn't ignore that he was making an effort. As the sun set, they sat on a bench in the garden, watching the warm colors of the sky. "I never imagined I'd be here doing something like this," Layla said almost to herself. "Neither did I," Henry responded with a slight smile. "But maybe this is exactly where we need to be?" Layla looked at him, noticing that for the first time, Henry seemed to be letting his guard down. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance that this wasn't just a contract, but the beginning of something much bigger. The morning started like any other. Layla felt the weight of the months of pregnancy in every movement, but she was determined to keep her routine. Henry, as usual, was in his office, buried in documents. Their interactions had become more frequent and had evolved into a kind of silent comfort for both of them. But that day, something was different. Just before lunch, Layla felt a sudden pain. It was different from any discomfort she had felt before. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was just another typical pregnancy ache, but the intensity increased. Alarmed, she called Stephanie, who immediately realized the seriousness of the situation. "Henry needs to know about this," Stephanie said, helping Layla to sit down. "This could be the start of labor." Layla nodded, trying to control her breathing as another wave of pain hit her. Stephanie quickly went to get Henry. Within minutes, he appeared in the room. Seeing her, his usually impassive face showed something rare, genuine concern. "Layla, what's happening?" he asked quickly, approaching her. "I think it's happening," she said, gasping for breath. "The babies are coming." For a moment, Henry seemed frozen, but then he quickly regained control. He grabbed the phone, ordering the driver to get the car ready, and instructed Stephanie to gather everything they would need for the hospital. "We're going now," he said, his voice firm but with a touch of urgency that Layla had never heard from him before. The ride to the hospital was a blur of emotions. Layla focused on managing the pain, while Henry, sitting next to her, watched her with a mix of anxiety and helplessness. Henry held her hand during the trip, a gesture that seemed automatic yet carried so much meaning. "We're almost there," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "You'll be okay. We'll be okay." Layla didn't respond, but she felt a strange calm from his words. There was something about his tone, the way his grip tightened, that gave her a sense of reassurance amidst the chaos. At the hospital, everything happened in a blur. A medical team was already on standby, ready to act thanks to Henry's meticulous planning. Layla was rushed directly to the delivery room. He stayed by her side, not leaving for a single moment, even as the staff urged him to wait outside. "I'm staying," he said firmly, his voice unwavering as he continued to hold Layla's hand. "I'm not going anywhere." The hours that followed were unlike anything Henry had ever experienced. He watched in awe as Layla displayed a strength he never imagined, bringing their twins into the world. Each moment seemed to drag on endlessly, but it was filled with a powerful intensity he couldn't comprehend. Finally, the room was pierced by the first cry, small but full of life, reverberating like a wave of emotion. "A boy," the doctor announced, smiling warmly. "A healthy, beautiful boy." Henry's heart raced, his eyes never leaving the baby, who was gently placed on a nearby table. He was still trying to process what had just happened when, almost immediately, a second cry filled the room. A girl, their daughter. Layla, exhausted but with her eyes still shining, looked at the two tiny babies being carefully cleaned and wrapped in soft blankets. She longed to hold them, but knew that moment would be brief. Henry stood frozen for a few seconds, watching the doctor's work. Then, as though something inside him had finally broken free, he stepped closer to Layla. He took her hand, his voice thick with emotion as he whispered, "You were incredible." "Thank you." Silent tears streamed down Layla's face, but she couldn't tell if they were from joy, relief, or the heartache that was already beginning to settle in. The weight of the moment was overwhelming. Soon after, the babies were handed to her. She held them carefully, feeling the warmth and fragility of their small lives. Layla studied them, taking in every little detail, their tiny closed eyes, their small fingers moving involuntarily. It was an overwhelming, all-consuming love, and in that instant, she knew that there would be no way to leave them without carrying a part of them with her forever. Henry stayed by her side, silent but visibly moved. When it was his turn to hold their son, his usually hardened expression softened in a way Layla had never seen before. He seemed to connect with something far beyond the idea of an heir. It wasn't just about legacy anymore. It was life, pure and untainted. It was a bond Henry had never experienced before. When he held their daughter, he closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to imprint the moment into his memory. When he opened them, he looked at Layla, and she saw something she never expected: genuine gratitude. "They're perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Layla nodded, still holding their son in her arms. Tears streamed down her face freely now, but she didn't care. The world seemed to melt away in that moment, leaving only the three of them, a family just as they had always dreamed. That night, while Layla rested in her room, Henry stayed by the baby's side in the hospital's observation area. He watched them sleep, feeling a flood of emotions that he didn't know how to control. For the first time, he realized that these children weren't just part of a plan or a legacy. They were his connection to something greater, something he had never allowed himself to feel before: true love. Stephanie arrived carrying a cup of coffee. She placed it on a nearby table and gently asked, "Mr. Lewis, is everything all right?" Henry looked at her, clearly struggling to find the right words. For the first time in a long while, he replied, "I think it is." Stephanie smiled warmly, then quietly left, leaving Henry alone with his thoughts and his children. Meanwhile, in her room, Layla woke up feeling an intense loneliness. Despite the joy she should have been feeling, the contract still loomed over everything. The babies, now the center of her existence, wouldn't be hers for much longer. But then, when she looked at the door and saw Henry walking in with both babies in his arms, something inside her shifted. He looked different, as if that moment had transformed not just him, but them both. The bond with the babies was undeniable, but it was also the connection he had with her. He approached the bed, gently handed her the boy, and then sat beside her, holding the girl. In that moment, something shifted. He couldn't explain it, but he knew everything had changed. He confessed, his gaze fixed on the twins. Layla nodded, knowing in her heart that no matter how difficult the path ahead might be, this moment was a miracle she would never forget. Months later, Henry's mansion was heavy with a suffocating silence. Layla could feel it in the air. She knew what the day represented. The weeks following the birth of the twins had been a whirlwind, a blend of overwhelming joy and gut-wrenching anguish. She loved them more than she ever thought possible, but the reality of her situation remained clear. The contract she had signed was now inescapable. Today, she had to leave everything behind. As she packed her few belongings into a small suitcase, Layla stole one last glance at the twins' cribs. The babies slept soundly, unaware of the turmoil surrounding them. Tears threatened to fall, but she refused to cry. She didn't want her last memories of them to be tainted by weakness. She had signed the agreement, and she told herself that walking away was the right thing to do. There was a soft knock at the door. Stephanie entered, her face filled with concern. "Is everything ready?" she asked quietly. Layla nodded, forcing back the lump in her throat. "Yes, thank you for everything." Stephanie hesitated before speaking again. "Are you sure this is what you want? It seems like there's something more between you and Mr. Lewis." Layla smiled weakly, though her heart felt as though it was breaking. "It's not about what I want, Stephanie. It's about what was agreed upon." Stephanie didn't press further. She simply nodded and left the room, promising to inform Henry that Layla was ready to leave. Layla walked down the stairs, suitcase in hand, her heart heavy with each step. In the foyer, Henry was waiting for her. He stood near the front door, his eyes fixed on her, his usual cold and calculating demeanor completely absent. Instead, he looked vulnerable, like a man about to lose something he cared deeply about. "Everything's ready," Layla said, breaking the silence. Henry didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step toward her, his gaze intense. "Are you really leaving?" His voice was low, almost hoarse. Layla felt a lump form in her throat, but she held her ground. "That was the deal. I've done my part. Now it's time to move on." For a long moment, Henry stood motionless, as though frozen by the weight of her words. Finally, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out the contract. He held it between his fingers as if it were nothing more than a piece of scrap paper. "This contract," he began, his voice steadier now, "should never have defined what's happening between us." Before Layla could respond, Henry tore the paper into pieces. The sound of the tearing echoed through the foyer like a declaration. "I don't want you to go," he said. "I don't want this to end here." Layla froze, her eyes locked on the torn pieces of paper scattered on the floor. Her heart raced, but she couldn't move. Fear and pain kept her rooted in place. "Henry," she said softly, her voice trembling, "you can't just tear up a contract and expect that to change everything. It's not that simple." Henry took another step toward her, his expression full of emotion. "I know it's not simple. Nothing about this has been simple for me. But these past few months have shown me something I never had the courage to admit. I need you, Layla. Not just because of the twins, but because you've brought something into my life that I didn't even know was missing." His words hit her harder than she ever expected. They pierced her heart, yet she shook her head, struggling to resist the overwhelming wave of emotion. "And how do I know this is real?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How can I trust that you won't change your mind, that you won't pull away when things get tough?" Henry's face softened, and he took a deep breath. He seemed to be battling his own insecurities, but he pressed on. Because I've already tried living without feeling anything for anyone, and it left me empty. You showed me that I don't have to be afraid of connecting, of being human. And yes, it scares me, but I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you. Layla's eyes filled with tears, but she still couldn't overcome the wall that separated her from him. I fell in love with you, Henry, she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. But you don't understand how hard it is to trust someone again. I've spent my whole life being discarded, ignored. How can I believe you won't do the same? Henry moved closer, his presence overwhelming. He was so near now that she could feel his breath, warm against her skin. Because you changed everything for me, he said, his voice low but steady. And I'm not the kind of man who says that lightly. I don't know how to prove it to you, Layla, but I'm willing to try every day for the rest of my life if you'll let me. His words hit her like a blow, shattering her defenses. You give me that chance. Layla felt something inside her begin to waver. She knew there were risks, but for the first time she wondered if it was worth facing them. What if it doesn't work out? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Henry took her hands gently, his gaze never leaving hers. Then we'll try again and again if necessary. I won't give up on you, Layla, he promised, his voice unwavering. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. Layla's doubts began to fade, slowly replaced by something stronger, hope. She looked into Henry's eyes and saw something that spoke deeper than words. His willingness to let go of control, to break down barriers, to be with her. Finally, after a long pause, she nodded, her tears falling freely. Okay, I'll stay. Henry let out a sigh of relief and pulled her into a tight embrace. For the first time in a long while, Layla felt that this was where she was meant to be. The world outside seemed distant, insignificant in that moment. As the first light of dawn broke over Henry's mansion, Layla awoke to the soft sounds of the twins in the nursery next door. There was something different about this morning, something lighter. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the heavy weight of uncertainty, nor the tension of living under the terms of a contract. She had chosen to stay, and more importantly, Henry had chosen to open his heart to her. Together, they were beginning to build something real, something lasting. Layla quietly got out of bed and made her way to the nursery. She found the twins awake, cooing softly as they moved in their cribs. She leaned over them, stroking their rosy cheeks and whispering words of affection. Before she could lose herself in the peaceful moment, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Henry standing in the doorway, watching the scene with a slight smile on his face. His eyes, which had always conveyed control and distance, were now softer, filled with an emotion Layla could only describe as love. "Good morning," he said, stepping into the room and approaching the babies. "Good morning," Layla replied, her voice warm with a smile. Henry gently picked up the baby boy, holding him with a tenderness that made Layla's heart swell. Henry looked at the baby, his eyes sparkling. "I never imagined this moment would feel so natural," he confessed, almost to himself. Layla smiled as she watched him. There was something deeply fulfilling about seeing Henry grow into his role as a father. His devotion to the twins spoke volumes about the changes he was willing to make for their sake. The weeks that followed were a time of adjustment. Henry, though inexperienced, made every effort to learn how to care for the babies. He changed diapers, clumsy at first, fed them bottles, and even sang lullabies, his gravelly voice far from melodic but full of love. For Layla, this effort was proof that he was truly changing. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, the twins sleeping peacefully in their cribs nearby, Henry turned to Layla. His expression was serious, yet calm. "I've been thinking about something," he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. Layla turned toward him, curious. "What is it?" He took a deep breath before speaking again. I want us to be a real family, not just because of the twins, but because I want you by my side forever. Layla was silent for a moment, taken aback by the depth of his words. She knew their feelings for each other had grown, but hearing this confession was something she hadn't expected. "Henry," she began, trying to process the intensity of the moment. "This is a big step. Are you sure?" Henry reached out, taking her hands in his. He looked deeply into her eyes, his expression full of sincerity. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I know this won't be easy, and I know I've made mistakes in the past, but I want to build something with you. Something real, something based on love, not contracts or obligations." His words were genuine, and Layla felt tears welling up in her eyes. She nodded, her heart full. "I want that too." And so, a few weeks later, an intimate ceremony was held in the mansion's beautiful garden. Only a few close friends and family were invited, Stephanie and the staff members who had become an important part of their journey. The day was perfect. The sun was shining, and a gentle breeze stirred the flowers decorating the venue. Layla wore a simple, elegant dress, while Henry looked sharp in his suit. The twins, dressed adorably, were held by Stephanie, who couldn't hide her tears of joy. When Henry and Layla exchanged vows, they spoke from the heart. Henry promised to be the man Layla deserved, someone who would always stand by her, no matter what. Layla, in turn, promised to trust him and help him become the best version of himself. At the end of the ceremony, as they stood together, holding their babies, Stephanie remarked, "You make a beautiful family." It was true. For the first time, Henry, Layla, and the babies were exactly where they were meant to be. After the ceremony, life continued, its challenges balanced by moments of pure joy. Henry and Layla worked together to create a warm, loving home for the twins. They learned to be parents, facing sleepless nights and constant demands, their exhaustion tempered by the happiness their little ones brought into their lives. One night, as Layla was putting the babies to bed, Henry appeared in the bedroom door. Without saying a word, he wrapped her in a tight embrace. Layla rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, a rhythm that had become so familiar. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he said softly. Layla smiled, her heart full. "Thank you for showing me I could trust again." Months later, on a warm, sunny afternoon, Henry and Layla sat in the garden, watching the twins play on a soft mat in the grass. The baby's laughter filled the air, a pure and infectious joy. Layla turned to Henry, who was sitting beside her, smiling at the scene. "Are you happy?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity. He looked at her, then at the twins, before answering. "I never thought I could be this happy. You've given me more than I ever knew I needed. Layla, a family, purpose, love." Layla smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. "And you've shown me that love can be built, even through challenges. Thank you for that." As they leaned in for a gentle kiss, the twins babbled something that sounded like Mama and Dada. Henry and Layla laughed, overwhelmed with emotion. They moved closer to the little ones, wrapping them in all the love they had to offer. That moment, simple, unassuming, was proof that they had found something real. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was a life full of love, understanding, and hope. And that was all they needed to move forward. What do you think of Henry's actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. How would you rate this story from 0 to 10? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to stay updated with all our latest stories. Don't forget to check out more touching stories by clicking here on the end screen. Passenger seat. The air between them was thick with tension, but neither spoke. Henry focused on the road, his mind already turning over the conversation that was about to unfold. He drove in silence, eventually pulling into a quiet cafe away from the noise of the city. He parked, then turned to her. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer now, though still with an edge of business. "Leah Parker," she replied flatly. "But why does it matter?" Henry leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving her face. "I need to know who I'm dealing with, so tell me, Leah, why do you sit on the sidewalk drawing like that, as if nothing else matters?" She shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "What else is there to do? I have nowhere to go. I lost everything, but that's none of your business." Henry studied her closely. There was a sadness in her words, but also an underlying strength, a resilience that made her more than just a homeless woman with nothing left. Despite the dirt on her clothes and the weariness in her eyes, she had a certain fire that drew his attention. "Everything?" he asked. "What do you mean by that?" Leah glanced at him briefly, her gaze almost piercing. "Does it really matter?" "You don't care. You're just here for something else." Henry sighed, leaning forward. He knew there was more to her story, something deeper. But for now, that wasn't his priority. He had a deal in mind, and he needed her for it. Something told him that despite the sharp edges of their interaction, there was more to this woman than met the eye. And so, as they sat in that quiet cafe, a contract was silently forming between them. It was the beginning of an unexpected deal, one that would change both of their lives forever. Resting his elbows on the table, Henry leaned forward, his gaze fixed intently on Layla. "I'll get straight to the point," he said, his voice steady and serious. "I want to make you an offer, something that could change your life." Layla's eyes narrowed and she stared at him, confused. "What would that be?" she asked, her voice cautious. "I want you to have a child for me," he stated bluntly. Layla blinked as though she hadn't heard him correctly. "You're joking, right?" she asked, disbelief thick in her voice. "No," Henry replied calmly. "This is a serious offer. I'll cover all your expenses, provide full support during the pregnancy, and in the end, you'll receive an amount that will ensure you never have to worry about money again." She let out a nervous laugh, crossing her arms in disbelief. "This has to be a joke," she muttered, her mind struggling to grasp the weight of his words. What kind of man makes such an offer to a stranger? "The kind of man who knows what he wants and doesn't waste time," Henry said, his tone unwavering. "I don't want a relationship, Layla. I don't want emotional drama. I just want a child. Simple as that." Layla stared at him, her mind racing as the words, "I want you to have my child," echoed in her thoughts. Despite her initial impulse to dismiss him as insane, there was something in his eyes, something cold and calculating, that told her he was serious. His gaze was firm, unwavering, and it hit her hard. She felt torn. On one side, there was her dignity, the woman she wanted to be, and on the other, there was the harsh reality of her life, a life full of struggles, where each day was a battle just to survive. "This is madness," she finally whispered, her voice shaky with disbelief. No woman in her right mind would agree to something like this. Henry didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He kept his posture perfectly controlled, his every movement deliberate. "No woman in your position would refuse," he replied, his words cutting through the tension in the room. "I'm offering you a way out, comfort, stability, a new life, in exchange for something you already have, the ability to bear a child." Layla crossed her arms, trying to maintain a facade of resistance, but deep down, she knew Henry was right. Every day she scraped by, barely surviving. The idea of security, of having her life handed back to her on a silver platter, was tempting. But the cost was something so personal. It made her stomach churn. "And then what?" she asked, her voice heavy with skepticism. "What happens after the baby is born?" Henry leaned back in his chair, his body language shifting slightly as if he had anticipated the question. "After the baby is born, you'll receive a substantial sum to start your life over," he said, his tone almost relaxed now. "No strings attached. You'll be free to do whatever you want. No strings attached." She let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head. "And how do I know you won't change your mind later? Drag me into court, or worse." Henry studied her carefully, his eyes narrowing slightly as he weighed his words. "Layla, I'm a businessman," he said. "I don't enter into agreements without ensuring all parties benefit. You'll have a legally binding contract. Neither of us will be able to change the terms afterward." A silence fell between them, and Layla couldn't help but absorb his words. The promise of security, of stability, was tempting. It was more than she had ever had. She had nothing now, not even a place to sleep that night. The idea of walking away from the streets, from the constant cold and hunger, was enough to make her pulse quicken. But she also knew this was a life-altering decision. She was standing on the edge of something huge, and she needed to think it through. "What if I say no?" she challenged, leaning forward slightly, her eyes locking with his. Henry gave a faint, almost pitying smile. "Then you go back to the streets. Keep scraping by, facing the cold, the hunger. The choice is yours." His words hit her like a blow. She wanted to hate him for being so blunt, so cold, but deep down, she hated even more the truth in them. He was right. She had been backed into a corner. She knew it. She could feel it. But there was one last thing she needed to ask, one thing that gnawed at her. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice shaky but resolute. "A man like you, with all your money, why not adopt a child or find one of those wealthy women who love showing off their perfect kids?" Henry took a deep breath before answering. His tone grew more serious, the weight of his words sinking in. "Because I want something that's mine," he said, his voice cold. "An heir of my own blood. And because adopting or getting involved with someone in my social circle brings complications I'm simply not willing to deal with. I want control, Layla. Nothing more, nothing less." The coldness in his words made her look away, feeling a pang of unease. He was being honest, and that honesty, that truth, made her feel more vulnerable than she had ever felt in her life. "I need time to think," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. The room was thick with silence as Layla leaned back in her chair, the weight of the decision before her pressing down like a heavy stone. She had no easy answers. There were no simple choices, just the harsh reality of survival. And as she sat there, contemplating her next move, the only thing she knew for sure was that nothing in her life would ever be the same again. Finally, trying to regain some control over the situation, Henry nodded as if he had expected this response. "You have 24 hours. After that, don't bother contacting me." He stood up, walking toward the door without another word. Lila watched as he disappeared, feeling as though she were being pulled into a whirlwind, one she might never escape. Walking through the streets, Lila's thoughts raced. Henry's words echoed in her mind. Comfort, stability, a new life. She knew all too well what it meant to have nothing. The biting cold of the night stung her skin, a harsh reminder that tomorrow would bring the same struggles, fighting for food, constantly living in fear, and enduring the humiliation of being invisible to the world. She sat on a park bench staring at the overcast sky, lost in thought. Her mother used to say that opportunities only knock once, and it's up to you to decide whether to seize them or let them slip away. But at what cost, she wondered. Having a child, even as part of a deal, was a monumental decision. But what if it was her only chance to escape the endless cycle of misery? Meanwhile, Henry sat in his living room, reviewing a contract his lawyers had meticulously prepared. He hated waiting, but he knew Lila didn't have many options. Regardless, he had already calculated the risks. If she declined, he would simply move on to someone else. It was that simple. The sound of the intercom interrupted his thoughts. He picked up, hearing his receptionist's voice inform him that Lila had arrived. "Send her up," he replied, his tone neutral. Minutes later, the door opened and Lila walked in. Her eyes were tired, but there was a certain determination in them. "I accept," she said bluntly. Before Henry could say anything, he stood up, observing her carefully. There was no hesitation in her expression, just a firm decision. "Great, let's make this official," he said, motioning for her to sit as he picked up the contract from the table. Lila looked at the document, reading the terms carefully. The conditions were clear. She would be taken care of throughout the pregnancy, with all her expenses paid. In the end, she would receive a significant sum to restart her life. In return, she would give up any rights to the child. "This seems final," she murmured as she read the agreement. "That's exactly what I want," Henry replied, "and I hope it's what you want too." Lila took a deep breath and, after a moment of hesitation, picked up the pen. With a quick motion, she signed her name, sealing the agreement that would change their lives forever. The signing of the contract was more than just a business deal. It marked the beginning of a new phase in Lila Parker's life. That same day, she was escorted by Stephanie, Henry's assistant, to a black car waiting at the building's entrance. As Lila looked out the car window, the city, which had once felt overwhelming, now seemed to offer something different, a chance to start over. Lila didn't speak much during the ride to Henry's mansion, but Stephanie tried to break the silence. "You'll like the place. It's quiet, spacious, and most importantly, comfortable." Her friendly tone contrasted sharply with the cold reality of the contract Lila had just signed. Lila nodded, still processing everything that had happened in the past few hours. When the car finally arrived at the mansion, her eyes widened. The monumental iron gate opened, revealing a property surrounded by impeccably maintained gardens. At the center of it all was the mansion itself, an imposing marble and glass structure that seemed as cold and calculating as the man who owned it. Stephanie led her inside, and Lila barely had time to take in the extravagant details: crystal chandeliers, wide marble staircases, and furniture that looked like it came straight out of a design magazine. It all made her uncomfortable. This wasn't her world, but for now, it would be her new reality. "I'll show you to your room," Stephanie said with a smile. "It's one of the best suites in the house." Lila followed in silence. Upon entering the room, she was greeted by a huge bed with soft linen sheets, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a bathroom larger than any apartment she had ever lived in. "If you need anything, just call me. We're here to take care of you," Stephanie added before leaving her alone. Lila sat on the edge of the bed, running her hands over the soft fabric of the sheets. It was strange. Just yesterday, she had been sleeping on cold sidewalk walks, and now she was surrounded by luxury. But as comfortable as it was, there was still something unsettling. A feeling deep inside her that she couldn't shake off. The heavy atmosphere in the air was unmistakable. Layla knew it wasn't just a guest. She was now part of a business deal. In the days that followed, she tried to adjust to the new routine. Meals were served promptly, and a team of doctors had been hired to conduct initial exams. As expected, Henry kept his distance. He was focused on work, rarely appearing around the house except to check the report Stephanie sent him about Layla's progress. One of those rare times they crossed paths was in the hallway. Layla had just left a medical appointment when she saw Henry walking toward her. His usual impeccable posture and serious expression were unmistakable. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone more of an obligation than genuine concern. Layla hesitated before answering. "Everything is as expected, I guess." He nodded without delving deeper into the conversation. But before walking away, he turned back and gave her a final look. "If you need anything," he said, "I want you to be well." Layla wasn't sure what to make of his words. Was it genuine kindness, or simply a way to ensure the agreement went smoothly? Either way, the brief encounter lingered in her mind. Despite being treated like a queen, Layla couldn't ignore the dilemmas that were starting to rise within her. One quiet night, she walked out onto the balcony of her room, gazing at the vast garden illuminated by the moonlight. The serene calmness of the scene felt so far removed from the reality she once knew. "Am I doing the right thing?" she thought, hugging herself against the cold wind. The idea of carrying a child and then giving it away seemed increasingly complex. Although the contract made it clear she would have no rights to the child, she couldn't help but wonder how she would handle it emotionally. Meanwhile, Henry observed everything from a distance. He knew Layla was resilient, but he also recognized the emotional weight she carried. Despite his cold demeanor, there was a faint twinge of curiosity about her. Who was this woman who had accepted such an unusual proposal? And why couldn't he completely shake the feeling that she was more than just a part of a plan? One evening, Layla was in the living room browsing through a book from the shelf. She wasn't a fan of classic literature, but there was something comforting about the quiet of the house and the scent of old books. Henry walked in, surprising her. He seemed distracted, holding a folder of documents in his hand. "I didn't expect to find you here," he said, stopping in the middle of the room. Layla shot him a sarcastic smile. "I didn't expect you to talk to me." He frowned but didn't respond right away. Instead, he placed the folder on the table and sat down in a nearby armchair. "Are you settling in?" he asked, crossing his arms. "I think so," she replied hesitantly. "But it still feels strange. It doesn't feel real." Henry leaned forward slightly, his voice firm. "It does have to feel strange. This is a contract, Layla, an agreement. I assure you, everything will be carried out exactly as planned." "That's what you do, isn't it?" she said with a hint of defiance. "Plan everything, calculate everything, leave no room for mistakes." He looked at her closely, as if deciding whether the conversation was worth continuing. "That's how I've built everything I have," he finally replied. "Planning prevents failure." Layla gave a short laugh, shaking her head. "Sometimes failure is inevitable," she said. "You can plan everything, but you can't control how you feel." Her words seemed to hit Henry like a blow. He leaned back in the chair, silent, and she noticed his reaction. But she didn't push him further. She simply picked up the book from the shelf and headed to her room, leaving Henry alone with his thoughts. The days went by, and Layla Parker began adjusting to life in Henry Lewis's mansion. While the environment was grand and comfortable, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. Every expensive piece of furniture, every decorative object, seemed to scream that this was not her place. Still, she followed the routine: frequent medical appointments, meals prepared by chefs. Despite the luxury, an emotional emptiness lingered. At night, alone in her room, she thought about what she had left behind. Not that it was much, but it was the only life she had known. Now, everything felt out of control. What would it be like to carry a child and then hand it over? She tried to push those thoughts away, but they haunted her, especially in the stillness of night. While Layla grappled with her internal conflicts, Henry continued to watch her from a distance. He had never allowed emotions to interfere with his decisions, but something about Layla's vulnerability had begun to stir something in him. He knew she was strong, but the weight of what she was going through seemed to weigh heavily on her. There was more to her than he had initially believed. Henry had always kept a reserved demeanor, carefully maintaining distance from others, even in the midst of his busy life filled with meetings and commitments. Yet, despite his best efforts, he found himself thinking about her more than he had expected. It wasn't romantic or emotional, not yet at least, but rather a curiosity he couldn't quite explain. This feeling, however, was persistent. One afternoon, after a long, exhausting day of meetings, Henry returned home and made his way to the garden. There, sitting on a bench with her face tilted toward the sky, he found Lila. The scene before him was a stark contrast to the tough, professional image he had always associated with her. For a brief moment he hesitated, unsure whether to approach her. Yet, something about the peacefulness of the moment drew him in, and he eventually decided to walk over to her, taking in the serene beauty of the garden around them. "Are you enjoying the garden?" he asked in his usual firm, direct tone. Lila turned toward him, slightly surprised, but quickly regained her composure. "It's nice," she said. "Definitely better than the streets." Henry sat beside her, still keeping some distance. Though there was something disarming about Lila's honesty, it was refreshing in a way. "Are you settling in?" he asked, genuinely curious. Lila looked at the flowers in front of her, then shrugged. "It still feels strange," she admitted, "like I'm living someone else's life." Henry fell silent for a moment, letting her words sink in. "It's all part of the agreement," he said, his voice steady. "I want you to have everything you need so that everything goes as planned." Lila echoed his sentiment with a hint of irony, raising an eyebrow. "Do you always live like this, planning every second of your life?" Henry was taken aback by the question. He was used to people simply agreeing with him, not challenging him. He paused for a moment, then answered, his voice firm. "Planning is what keeps everything running. Without it, everything falls apart." Lila gave a faint smile, shaking her head slightly. "I don't think everything can be controlled," she said quietly. "Sometimes things just happen, whether you want them to or not." Her words unsettled Henry more than he cared to admit. They lingered in the air between them, but there was something comforting about the quiet of the house and the scent of old books. Henry walked in, surprising her. He seemed distracted, holding a folder of documents in his hand. "I didn't expect to find you here," he said, stopping in the middle of the room. Layla shot him a sarcastic smile. "I didn't expect you to talk to me." He frowned but didn't respond right away. Instead, he placed the folder on the table and sat down in a nearby armchair. "Are you settling in?" he asked, crossing his arms. "I think so," she replied hesitantly. "But it still feels strange. It doesn't feel real." Henry leaned forward slightly, his voice firm. "It does have to feel strange. This is a contract, Layla, an agreement. I assure you, everything will be carried out exactly as planned." "That's what you do, isn't it?" she said with a hint of defiance. "Plan everything, calculate everything, leave no room for mistakes." He looked at her closely, as if deciding whether the conversation was worth continuing. "That's how I've built everything I have," he finally replied. "Planning prevents failure." Layla gave a short laugh, shaking her head. "Sometimes failure is inevitable," she said. "You can plan everything, but you can't control how you feel." Her words seemed to hit Henry like a blow. He leaned back in the chair, silent, and she noticed his reaction. But she didn't push him further. She simply picked up the book from the shelf and headed to her room, leaving Henry alone with his thoughts. The days went by, and Layla Parker began adjusting to life in Henry Lewis's mansion. While the environment was grand and comfortable, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. Every expensive piece of furniture, every decorative object seemed to scream that this was not her place. Still, she followed the routine, frequent medical appointments, meals prepared by chefs. Despite the luxury, an emotional emptiness lingered. At night, alone in her room, she thought about what she had left behind. Not that it was much, but it was the only life she had known. Now everything felt out of control. What would it be like to carry a child and then hand it over? She tried to push those thoughts away, but they haunted her, especially in the stillness of night. While Layla grappled with her internal conflicts, Henry continued to watch her from a distance. He had never allowed emotions to interfere with his decisions, but something about Layla's vulnerability had begun to stir something in him. He knew she was strong, but the weight of what she was going through seemed to weigh heavily on her. There was more to her than he had initially believed. Henry had always kept a reserved demeanor, carefully maintaining distance from others, even in the midst of his busy life filled with meetings and commitments. Yet, despite his best efforts, he found himself thinking about her more than he had expected. It wasn't romantic or emotional, not yet at least, but rather a curiosity he couldn't quite explain. This feeling, however, was persistent. One afternoon, after a long, exhausting day of meetings, Henry returned home and made his way to the garden. There, sitting on a bench with her face tilted toward the sky, he found Lila. The scene before him was a stark contrast to the tough, professional image he had always associated with her. For a brief moment, he hesitated, unsure whether to approach her. Yet, something about the peacefulness of the moment drew him in, and he eventually decided to walk over to her, taking in the serene beauty of the garden around them. "Are you enjoying the garden?" he asked in his usual firm, direct tone. Lila turned toward him, slightly surprised, but quickly regained her composure. "It's nice," she said. "Definitely better than the streets." Henry sat beside her, still keeping some distance, though there was something disarming about Lila's honesty. It was refreshing in a way. "Are you settling in?" he asked, genuinely curious. Lila looked at the flowers in front of her, then shrugged. "It still feels strange," she admitted, "like I'm living someone else's life." Henry fell silent for a moment, letting her words sink in. "It's all part of the agreement," he said, his voice steady. "I want you to have everything you need so that everything goes as planned." Lila echoed his sentiment with a hint of irony, raising an eyebrow. "Do you always live like this, planning every second of your life?" Henry was taken aback by the question. He was used to people simply agreeing with him, not challenging him. He paused for a moment, then answered, his voice firm. "Planning is what keeps everything running. Without it, everything falls apart." Lila gave a faint smile, shaking her head slightly. "I don't think everything can be controlled," she said quietly. "Sometimes things just happen, whether you want them to or not." Her words unsettled Henry more than he cared to admit. They lingered in the air between them, heavy and unexpected. After a long pause, he stood up abruptly, effectively ending the conversation. "If you need anything," he said, his voice tight, "let Stephanie know." He turned and walked back toward the house, his mind racing. A few days later, Henry found himself accompanying Lila to one of her medical appointments. He justified his presence by telling her it was simply to ensure everything was going well, but deep down, he felt a growing responsibility for the situation. Lila didn't seem particularly surprised by his decision, but internally, she was intrigued by it. At the doctor's office, the usual examinations were carried out. It wasn't until they heard the baby's heartbeat for the first time that something in the room shifted. Lila, who had been composed until then, suddenly felt a wave of unexpected emotion. Tears filled her eyes, but she quickly tried to hide them. Henry, on the other hand, remained still, his expression unreadable. Yet something in his gaze had changed. It was as if the simple sound of that heartbeat had touched something deep inside him, something he wasn't ready to face. "The baby looks perfect," the doctor said, smiling warmly. "You can start thinking about what you want to do next, like prenatal care and the next steps." Lila nodded, but Henry remained silent. His mind seemed distant, lost in thought. On the way back to the mansion, the silence in the car was heavy. Henry was visibly thoughtful, his face drawn in concentration. Lila, unsure of what to say, struggled to find the right words to fill the silence between them. The tension was palpable. When they finally arrived, Henry opened the door for her, a simple gesture that surprised Lila. It was uncharacteristic of him, and she couldn't help but notice the change in his behavior. "Thank you for today," Lila said as she got out of the car. "It was the least I could do," Henry replied, not meeting her gaze. I'll make sure everything continues to go well." Lila watched him as he walked back into the mansion, his posture as impeccable as always. But there was something different about him this time. Maybe it was the sound of the heartbeat that had touched something within him, something he had kept hidden for so long. Or perhaps it was just her imagination. In the days that followed, Lila began to notice small changes in Henry. He appeared more frequently in the common areas of the house, and their conversations, though brief, seemed less mechanical. He asked more personal questions about her appointments and how she was feeling. There was even a time when he suggested activities to help her relax. One evening, while they were dining in silence at the large dining table, Henry broke the silence by asking, "Have you thought about what you want to do after all this is over?" Lila was taken aback by the question. It was the first time he had asked her anything so personal, and the shift in their dynamic didn't go unnoticed. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. The thought of her future, beyond the current situation, felt so distant and uncertain. She looked at Henry, trying to read his expression, but he remained stoic, waiting for her answer. Lila took a deep breath, considering her response. "I don't know," she finally said. "I guess I haven't thought about it much." Henry nodded slowly, seemingly satisfied with her answer. But in the silence that followed, both of them were left with unspoken questions, emotions, and thoughts that lingered in the air, unresolved. Layla had never shown any particular interest in her future. "I don't have any plans," she replied honestly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I still don't know what my life will be like after this." Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful, as though he was considering her words carefully. "You'll have the resources to start over wherever you want. Just make sure you do something worthwhile," he said, his voice steady but with an undertone of advice. Layla looked at him, intrigued. Behind the calculated coldness that often surrounded him, she sensed a trace of genuine concern. It was a rare moment when she saw this side of him. She didn't quite know how to interpret it, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel completely alone in the mansion. One morning, Layla discovered a package left at the entrance of her room. It was wrapped impeccably, with a small handwritten note attached to it that simply read, "To help with your free time." Inside, she found a new sketchbook and a set of high-quality pencils. Layla was speechless. She hadn't expected this. She didn't even know that Henry knew about her love for drawing. During one of their earlier conversations, she had casually mentioned how she used to draw to distract herself from the chaos of life. But she never thought he would remember, let alone care enough to act on it. That night, as she was walking through the garden, Henry passed by her and stopped for a moment. "Did you like the gift?" he asked, his tone casual. Layla held the sketchbook tightly and looked at him, a smile tugging at her lips. "Yes," she said softly. "Thank you. I didn't expect this." Henry shrugged nonchalantly. "It seemed like something that could be good for you." Layla's grip on the sketchbook tightened, and she smiled more firmly. "It is," she replied simply. As the days went by, Layla began to realize that the routine in the mansion, though meticulously planned and comfortable, was not enough to ease the internal conflicts she felt. Each day, she experienced a deepening sense of emptiness, as if she were physically present but emotionally disconnected from everything happening around her. It was as though she was just going through the motions, with no real connection to the world or the people in it. Henry, on the other hand, maintained his usual firm and composed demeanor, but Layla had started to feel that there was more to him than he let on. She could sense a layer of complexity beneath his calm exterior, something he kept hidden, even from her. Then one morning, Layla was surprised by an unexpected request from Henry. He wanted to talk after breakfast. This was unusual. He rarely sought her out for conversation, and the distance between them was usually quite evident. After they finished their meal, Layla made her way to the sitting room, where Henry was already waiting. He sat next to a stack of papers, looking as composed as ever. I want to discuss some additional details of the contract, he said directly. Layla's heart tightened, her mind racing. Was he about to impose new conditions on her? More details? I thought everything was already settled, she replied, trying to mask her rising tension. Henry studied her for a moment before continuing. It's nothing that changes the terms. I just want to ensure you understand how things will be after the birth. I want to avoid any surprises. Layla took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. I think I get it. I leave and you go on with your life, she said, her voice tinged with resignation. Henry gave a small nod. Yes, but I want you to know that if you need anything afterward, regardless of the agreement, I'll be available to help. I don't want you to feel abandoned. Layla raised an eyebrow, surprised by the offer. His tone was different now, softer and more genuine, as if he was trying to show a level of consideration she hadn't seen from him before. That's unexpected coming from you, she said, unable to hide the sarcasm in her voice. Henry simply shrugged. I don't want complications, and this is the best way to avoid them. Layla chuckled, but there was something in his serious tone that made her reconsider. Could it be that he was actually trying to show concern? Maybe he was making an effort to be different, even if he wasn't entirely sure how. Later that day, Layla decided to explore the mansion more thoroughly. The place was vast, with seemingly endless hallways and rooms, each one decorated with artwork and antiques that probably cost more than she could imagine. As she wandered, she stumbled upon a small study at the end of a hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and her curiosity got the better of her. She peeked inside and saw Henry sitting at the desk. He wasn't working, though. He was holding a framed photograph in his hands, staring at it intently. Layla couldn't make out the details of the image, but something about his posture caught her attention. It was the first time she had ever seen him like this, vulnerable, lost in thought. She hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to disturb him, but she knocked softly on the door anyway. Henry quickly set the photograph back down on the desk, his usual neutral expression returning as he looked up at her. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Layla said hesitantly, stepping inside. It's nothing, Henry replied, his voice calm. Did you need something? Layla paused, feeling uncertain. She hadn't planned on speaking to him, but the moment felt like it required more than just a casual exchange. No, she said slowly. I was just exploring the house. She hesitated again, feeling as though she should say more. You seemed like you were thinking about something important. Henry remained silent for a moment, his eyes not meeting hers. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer than usual. We all have things we'd rather keep to ourselves, he said quietly. Layla didn't know how to respond. She had expected him to brush off the moment to maintain his usual cold exterior, but something about the way he spoke, so quietly, so introspective, made her pause. She realized that, like her, Henry too was carrying something beneath the surface, something he wasn't willing to share. Sensing that Henry didn't want to continue the conversation, Leah decided to shift the topic. This house is huge, she remarked casually, glancing around. Do you live here alone all the time? Henry nodded, crossing his arms as he leaned slightly back. It's more practical than it seems, he replied, his tone calm. I don't like distractions, and here I have all the space I need. Leah studied him carefully, trying to understand how someone could live surrounded by so much luxury and yet seem so lonely. She couldn't help but speak her mind. That must be strange, she said softly, having all of this, but no one to share it with. Henry avoided her gaze, clearly uncomfortable. I'm used to it, he replied flatly. I don't need anyone to do what I do. Leah wanted to believe him, but something in his tone suggested otherwise. Before she could respond, Henry stood up. If you need anything, he said, his voice curt, Stephanie can help. With that, he walked away, signaling the end of their conversation. That night, Leah went out onto the mansion's terrace. The sky was clear and the city lights sparkled in the distance. Sitting there, she allowed her mind to drift. She thought back to the sound of a baby's heartbeat she had heard during the checkup, a sound that had affected her in ways she couldn't fully explain. Despite her efforts to maintain emotional distance, she found it becoming harder to do so. Just as she was lost in her thoughts, she heard footsteps approaching from behind. Leah turned and saw Henry standing there, his expression weary, though he still held that same rigid posture. "You like this spot, don't you?" he asked as he walked closer. "It's peaceful." "I like the silence," Leah replied, her voice soft. "It helps me think." Henry stopped beside her, his gaze fixed on the city lights for a moment before he spoke again. "Thinking isn't always a good thing," he said quietly. Leah let out a short laugh, though it lacked humor. "Try telling that to someone who spends most of their time alone." Henry didn't respond right away, but when he did, his voice was gentler. "Sometimes being surrounded by people doesn't help much either." Leah glanced at him, noticing a new sadness in his voice, a sadness she hadn't heard before. She felt a pull within her, an instinct to reach out, but she resisted. "Maybe you need something you can't control," she said before she could stop herself. Her words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. She didn't regret saying them. Henry frowned as if he wanted to reply but decided against it. Instead, he turned away and walked off, leaving Leah alone with her thoughts. In the weeks that followed, Leah realized something. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't keep a solid barrier between herself and Henry. He remained an enigma, always difficult to read. Yet there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when fragments of his true self seemed to slip through the cracks. And despite her efforts to maintain distance, something inside her longed to understand the man who had brought her into this world. At the same time, Henry was struggling with emotions he couldn't name. He had entered into this arrangement expecting simplicity and control, but the situation was becoming far more complicated than he had anticipated. Leah wasn't just part of a plan anymore, and that realization both frightened and confused him. The following week, it was time for another checkup. Leah woke up early, her heart heavy with a mix of anxiety and curiosity. The months seemed to be passing by faster than she had imagined, and the idea of seeing the babies for the first time, even if it was just on a screen, made her pulse quicken. She wondered whether Henry would be there for this appointment, just like he had been the last time. When she came downstairs for breakfast, she found Stephanie sitting at the table going over some papers with Henry. Looking up from the folder of documents, he met her eyes and nodded. "Ready?" he asked, his tone neutral. Leah nodded in return, trying to sound calmer than she actually felt. "Ready." "Great. We'll go together," Henry said, his voice leaving no room for further discussion. Leah followed him silently to the car, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. Henry, as always, seemed focused, but there was something different about him today. His usual detachment was slightly more evident, yet there was a strange undercurrent of something else. Maybe he was nervous too, though he would never admit it. At the doctor's office, the physician greeted them with a warm smile. "Ready for the ultrasound?" he asked, motioning for Leah to lie down as he prepared the equipment. "Today we should be able to get a clearer view of the baby," the doctor explained, adjusting the monitor. Leah glanced at the screen, trying her best to ignore the cold gel the doctor applied to her abdomen. As the transducer moved over her skin, she held her breath, nervous about what she would see. Henry, standing beside her, crossed his arms and kept his eyes fixed on the monitor. The seconds felt like hours, but then a sound broke through the stillness, the steady, rhythmic beat of a heartbeat.